welcome to week 2 of the Scrappy Mt Ranges quilt along. This week we are making rows 1 through 3. The rows start at the bottom with the largest mountains and we're working up to the smallest ones. Here I have row 1 and row 2 and I love how it's coming together. I also have cut some of my strips, my 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, and 5.5 strips, and have pulled the foundations that I'll need. One of the things that I wasn't thinking about when I foundation paper pieced this was comparing my larger mountains to my smaller mountains, these two different ranges, and making sure there weren't, like a dark black with white mountain in the middle and another dark black with white top mountain in the middle. So, I mean, no one's going to notice it unless I pointed it out, which I just did, but something to think about that I wish I had thought about. Also, I know some people have gotten confused about which foundations to use. Lots of the foundations, the little shapes up here look very similar to each other. So take a really close look at them to make sure you're using the right foundation. That being said, as long as you're using the same size foundation, you can use any shape of mountain that you want. Like you could replace this with 3 mountain peaks. You could do whatever you want. In fact, I made a mistake. I grabbed the wrong foundation. This foundation, this mountain, is supposed to go over the top of this first mountain, and it doesn't. But they all still fit together. You just want to make sure they're the right size and that all the mountain peaks match. The first thing you do when you start making a row is refer to the first line of the instructions. This first line shows the outline of the different foundations you will need. These are the 5x10 foundations we need for row 3, and these are the 4x8 foundations we need. We're going to need 3 5x10 foundations, one of which has a peak with another mountain across from it. One has 2 half mountain peaks with a V. And the third has a quarter mountain peak, a middle mountain peak, and an overlapping half peak. Once you have those, and they can be, there's a lot of different designs with different mountain snow caps, so just pick whichever you want. Once you have that, it's really important that these mountains flow into each other. And so you want colors to continue from one mountain to another. You're going to start where the mountains meet. I'm going to have this peak be white, so I'll write down white, and this part of the peak also needs to be white. Snow cap, white, white. Then we'll have this down here be light blue, continuing over to light blue. Oh, this part of the snow cap also white. Now, these are the parts that really matter because they need to match. These mountains can be whatever color you want because they're not butting up to it. But if you want to plan, so you can plan the whole range, you can. Let's make this dark blue. And there's kind of a green blue. And you want this, anywhere the mountains overlap, you want there to be some amount of color difference and contrast between them. All right, and again, working from here, because I have a white peak, I think I'll do a different peak here. We'll do light blue, light blue, light blue, and I think we'll go gray here again. Gray, gray. And then I could choose what I want for that. This will help you stay organized. I don't know how many times I have made a mistake because I did not label. Okay, also one other thing to recognize is that once these are sewn together, I'm gonna kind of mimic sewing them together by pinning them. This is the way it'll look on the back, and on the front, I'm going to put this big pin over here. I guess it's kind of a needle. Once we flip it over, fabric will be on this side. And this side that we saw on the foundation is now this side that we see in fabric. So your foundations are the mirror image of what you'll see on the front. So just keep that in mind, because when you go down here, we have this three-peaked one over on this side. This row shows them all in fabrics, and you'll sew them together. After you foundation paper piece each mountain range section, you'll trim along the outside edge, along this seam allowance, sew them together. You'll sew each of the mountain ranges together. These ones are separate, they're not sewn together. And then you'll add on any little spacing strips, either on top, and I think in later ones there's some below. So sew them here first, and then sew this to this, to this, to this, left to right. You'll sew them together, and you'll press towards the spacing strips. Once you have each row sewn, you'll refer to the quilt layout. Just so you know, these mountains are not colored in because I wanted you to be able to use this as a coloring page, so I left them blank. However, this is the fabric side. This is this right here. So these are not the foundations. This is fabric. They're just left blank so you can color it. So what you'll do is you'll look row 1. I have row 1, and then there's a 2.5 inch strip that I put in between row 1 and row 2. Another 2.5 inch strip between row 2 and row 3 with a 2.5 inch strip on top of row 3. You can sew this on now. Pay attention as you go up. Some of the strips are 3.5 strips, and some rows don't have any strips between them when you get up to 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12, 13, 14. When you're sewing the long spacing strips to the rows and sewing just all the rows together, you don't want to just start sewing on one end and just sew all the way down. It's very easy for the rows and the spacing strips for the two pieces of fabric to feed through the sewing machine at different rates and not be even once you reach the far side. What you'll want to do is fold the row and the spacing strip in half separately. Mark the center with either with a pin or really crease it, then mark the centers of both, pin in the middle, pin on either side, and then pin a few times along the way. I recommend sewing the rows and the spacing strips together as you go. Don't wait until the very end, because then you'll have an hour worth of boring sewing strips together. If you sew them together now, it's just a little bit, and it's really fun to see this whole panel together. And then I won't have to sew it at the very end. I always put off sewing blocks together because I just don't like it. Another thing you might want to do is to remove the foundation papers as you go. So here's the back of the quilt. The foundation papers are still in. I've removed them from the seams so that I can press the seams open or to the side, whichever I feel works best. Since this is a bottom piece, I would not take out the foundations until I stay stitched using a small stitch length across the bottom. This keeps the fabric from stretching when the papers are removed. Also, I would, for these ones up here, because they're completely surrounded by fabric, both on top, bottom, sides, they're just fine to remove without any other issues. Foundations on the sides, stay stitched. Foundations surrounded by fabric, remove them. The number one thing that makes it hard to remove foundations is using too long of a stitch length. In almost all the cases I've had where people are saying, oh my gosh, it's so hard, they are using too long of a stitch length. You need to reduce your stitch length to at least 1.5, and some people even go down to 1, but I think that's a little too small. But somewhere between 1.5 and 1.3 is a great stitch length, and because the needle is punching holes so close together, it's perforating the papers very well, and they're pretty easy to pull out. You just go like this and just keep ripping till they're all out. This is a great thing to do while you watch TV. Just get a little garbage can and start ripping. We will use the same piecing strategy for each week of the quilt along. You'll foundation paper piece your mountains, sew them together with their sashing strips and spacing strips, and then sew the rows together. And I would recommend taking out the papers as you go. I can't wait to see pictures of what you sew, and I'm just so happy that you're sewing along.